We're all set to start. Erik, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And my name is Erik Berglof. I'm the Chief Economist of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And for us, Egypt is part of Asia. So we are very much honored to have this opportunity and to work with the Economic Research Forum. I've been fortunate to participate in a number of annual conferences, and I have very strong memories from those. And I'm a firm believer in the ERF and all that it stands for. Have benefited a lot over the years from the high quality work done by the ERF and its affiliated researchers. And I'm sure that these annual conferences are an important part of explaining how ERF has managed to create such a strong network and how it's managed to sustain it over time. So before I go into the topic of the evening, I wanted to give Shireen an opportunity to maybe give a few house rules. Shireen, can you?
Absolutely, lovely to have you, Erik, with us and to have Her Excellency with us. I'm sorry for that. I was tuned into the translation, and that's exactly the few announcements I'd like to make before Dr. Ibrahim extends the welcome and initiates the session. Three announcements. One, the session is actually being recorded and will be shown on the ERF YouTube channel following the session. Second, translation is availed. So there's a little globe on the right-hand side at the bottom where it says interpretation. Zoom doesn't allow for Arabic as a term yet. So if you want to tune into the Arabic, لو عايزين نتابع باللغة العربية, please assign into the Spanish channel. Please اختاروا channel Spanish للمتابعة بالعربي. And then the third and final announcement is really that should you wish at any point in time during the discussion, the conversation, the dialogue, this is designed differently than any standard presentation where there's going to be a dialogue happening between Erik and Her Excellency. So should you wish to have any questions at any point in time, you can put it through the Q&A section, or should you wish to have the floor, please raise your hand and we'll allow the floor. So with these just housekeeping announcements, I give the floor back to Erik and Dr. Ibrahim.
Okay, thank you very much, Shireen. I would like to take this opportunity really to welcome Her Excellency the Minister, Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, and also Dr. Erik Berglof, the Chief Economist of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I think it's really a privilege for us as a network to have among our community distinguished research economists like Dr. Rania, who also made the transition to get in the trenches, so to speak, and to hold the mantle of economic policy and development. And I think in large measure, when we obviously get an opportunity to hear her conversation with Erik, is that the success that Egypt has been able to achieve in the context of development partnership and development cooperation, I think in large measure, it supports the view that research economists and economists in general can actually make a huge contribution to the process of policy making from the perspective of knowledge, humility, that actually a genuine researcher will have to exercise, and also the ability to respond to changing environment environment and to learn from the various shocks and setbacks and successes that are associated with policy making. We are also quite delighted actually to have Erik with us as somebody, a distinguished researcher who has been a keen attendee and participants in ERF activities before, and he's now in a position actually also to collaborate with us as a leading economic research.
Ibrahim.
To collaborate with us in actually building analysis that benefit from comparative experiences. Definitely the Asian experience is a very important, interesting experience, but also I think this region will have something to offer as well. And then the issue of infrastructure is a very important policy angle and research angle to think about future development in the context of the emerging digital revolution and the future of works and all the kind of land, sea changes that are going to impact the global economies and the regional economies. I just from the perspective of having Dr. Rana with us here, that we had a very engaging and interesting conversation with ERF research associates. And we came up with some ideas about future research strategies and also fundraising to support the ERF to transit in an institutional way from sustainability to resilience. And I suggest these two instruments in addition to the kind of partnership that we have had with various institutions that have supported the ARF over the years, the World Bank, Ford Foundation, IDRC, the Arab Fund, as well as several other institutions that we were able to forge a relationship with them lately. That actually to think about building a reciprocal beneficial relationship with governments in the region, and then inviting our community, those members of our community who happens to be ministers and senior officials, to actually promote the cause of ERF, because I think the ultimate institutional transition to resilience would be to actually practice that partnership should start from home. And so we need both to build such a relationship with the governments of the region as well as the private sector of the regions, and to set an example for other generous supporters who have actually been supporting the ERF and the region over the years. So I thought that's an opportunity to highlight this, Dr. Rania, and also to also send a signal that you would really look forward to promote relationship with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Thank you very much, and over to you, Erik.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim. Thank you for inviting me to have this conversation with Dr. Rania. As you made some initial presentation, she doesn't really require much presentation in this circle, but she served her country as a central bank sub-governor, and she brought a lot of structure and rigor to monetary policy. And more recently, as Minister of Tourism, she brought massive change from using tourists to achieve structural transformation more broadly. She's also had 2 stints at the IMF in Washington, and most recently in the research department. So now she is Minister of International Cooperation. And here she has also brought winds of change, among other things, pioneering a multi-stakeholder platform that brings together all the international partners and stakeholders. I was actually in a G20 meeting last week where her model was used by the World Bank as a prototype for how to do in-country coordination with the international development partners, and of course working led by the national government, and how to engage all the relevant partners, making sure that there is certain core standards and common objectives and so on. I think that is a very important contribution that Dr. Rania has done. So we are supposed to talk about overseas development assistance, ODA. I've actually always wondered when they're going to stop using this term overseas. It has something distinctly colonial or imperial about it, and is very sort of Anglo-Saxon. I presume that most aid passes over one sea or another, but ODA is something that is much more widely distributed, and we need to think about how we can sustain ODA over time. It has been under threat for a long time. You know, the Sustainable Development Goals were supposed to shift away the focus from donors and recipients, and that we would all have to go through change to meet those goals. But there was a feeling, and I think there's still a feeling, that maybe developing countries got less attention because of the Sustainable Development Goals. And many has also worried that ODA would suffer during the crisis. It seems to have held up reasonably well, with some glaring exceptions. But the concern is, of course, now with donor countries coming out of the crisis with less fiscal space and maybe different priorities. So I thought we would spend this time together to think through ODA in a wider context of official flows to the developing world, and what can be done to increase those. So maybe just as a first question to start the conversation, you know, how do you see, Dr. Rania, the ODA and before and during the pandemic, and what are your concerns when you look at the impact of the pandemic on overseas development assistance?
Thank you very much, Erik. Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim, for hosting this panel during the annual meetings of the ERF. And of course, the theme is resilience towards change. And official development assistance is one of the sources of financing that is available to countries. However, as Erik mentioned, there's this perception that when we say official development assistance, that they are either handouts, food subsidies, or aid in a very, I would say, a conventional reflection of the term. However, official development assistance is international development financing, in the sense that today, when we take a look at the landscape of those who provide partnerships with countries for such financing, include AIIB, include EBRD, include the World Bank, African Development Bank, and many other multilateral institutions, which basically help countries implement their projects, which are designed in line with national priorities. So official development assistance are not just grants, they are actually concessional loans that are tackling different sectors in the economy, all sectors in the economy. If we talk about transportation, if we talk about renewable energy, if we talk about education, social solidarity programs, gender programs. So it really depends on how countries present their case. And Erik is absolutely correct that the SDGs have provided a common denominator, not just for countries, but also for those who provide the financing. A common denominator to be able to benchmark, to be able to tag each and every dollar with impact, each and every dollar with a goal that helps fulfill national objectives, but also adds to the global good, if you will.
So you know, one idea has been that maybe now we're hopefully coming out of this crisis. Actually, when you look at what's happening in the rest of Africa, it's is not so encouraging. But there's been this discussion now that really to help the recovery and the eventual rebuilding or building back better, we would try to front load overseas development assistance. The interest rates are very low now, and there are massive needs, of course, the scarring from the pandemic and so on. How do you see that? Do you think that's something that we should pursue?
Of course, Erik, when we take a look at the impact of the pandemic on the different economies in the developing world, it has had downside risks on growth rate, on employment, on the value chains and the supply chains that existed in countries. And therefore, in order to build back better, in order to try and push a recovery, front loading would be extremely sensible and important because it will help countries tackle the very narrowing fiscal space because of the retrenchment in revenues, given the halt in several activities, be it tourism, aviation, the services sector primarily. So absolutely, I mean, this is, I believe, a very important and timely recommendation and call that the different emerging or developing markets need to, I would say, mobilize efforts to push for more front-loaded assistance. And here, official development assistance is not just the grant, but actually the concessional loans that would be provided. But also every country has to show that as it's calling for that front-loaded financing, that it has particular, very well-defined projects that are going to tackle certain SDGs, and it has the capacity to implement. So I think it's a reciprocated responsibility of the multilateral institutions providing or willing to provide that, but also the countries being ready with very articulated projects on what to do going forward.
So when you look at the new strategy, you emphasized very rightly that it's not just about donations, it's about grants, it's about loans, it's about concessional lending, but it's also about more regular MDB lending. So all those things come together, and there are many different players. There are the MDBs, there are the national development finance institutions, and so on. How do you, from the point of view, a recipient, but also someone who observes more widely, what's happening in this space, how do you think it's working, this coordination between these different players?
Well, first, before I answer that question, Erik, let me just, for the audience, provide, shed light on something very important. When we, as countries, approach international institutions for this type of financing, it means that we are committed to principles of transparency, governance, and international principles of or environmental standards, because all of these institutions have boards which care very much about how procurement processes are done, how information is being shared. So again, any country that is engaging with the international community for this type of financing, which is considered concessional, low compared to the international market, long-term and so forth, it also shows that the government is committed to international standards. So that is a very important message for everyone who's listening to us. Your question about how coordination should be done, how can we ensure that there's complementarity across the different institutions. And you mentioned in your opening remarks, in our case, we created, being inspired by the G20 most eminent group persons, and you were one of them in 2018, where you called for country-led platforms that engage not just the international community with the country, but also it creates an opportunity for different types of financing to come in, being it from the private sector, being it from sovereign wealth funds, so that you have a mechanism by which the country leads its framework, presents it in a comprehensive way, creates the complementarity across the different agencies to basically avoid a waste of valuable resources or redundancies that could happen, and also share knowledge and so forth. So this is one very important mechanism that we adopted in 2020. Of course, we were all forced to be on screens as we are now, and we wanted to mobilize the international community with us in trying to mitigate the impact of COVID. So the best way was to create this digital platform. So we created the multi-stakeholder platforms, and it was very, very, very effective. In 2020, we started with health. It went after that to transportation, to agriculture. This year, 2021, we scaled it up to private sector engagement. And the idea is you have all stakeholders sitting together, hearing the vision, the plans going forward, and the financing needs. So it is a very effective mechanism that saves time and also creates a level of dialogue and understanding and transparency across all those who are involved on the table, those who are designing the projects, those who need the financing, those who are willing to give the financing.
Can you maybe give some examples from the pandemic now of specific progress? For example, I understand that Egypt has been quite successful in rolling out vaccines. I think Egypt has vaccinated as many people as the rest of Africa almost. I think it's something like that. So has this platform been helpful in achieving that, or are other results that you can point to?
Yeah, so at the very at the beginning of the pandemic, and this was in February and sorry, March and April of 2020, the Ministry of Health at the time, there was no vaccine, but there was need for certain equipment in hospitals and for the ministry. And there we collated, we had a multi-stakeholder platform, and we had our partners from Asia. I remember China, Japan, Korea, also USAID from the United States. And for instance, we had concessional loans with AFD in France, and they were tweaked to actually be able to meet a health issue rather than go to another sector. So this ability of mobilizing your development partners, and when you are very clear on what is required, there is a lot of agility when it comes to identifying where to place resources as priorities, given the dynamic world we're living in. Something else which was also quite important, Egypt is doing an overhaul of its transportation sector. And we have very ambitious plans when it comes to railway, when it comes to a metro and so forth. So even in the pandemic, that work did not stop. And we had the Minister of Transportation lay out what the future plans are. And there was complementarity across development partners in financing these projects. So we have initiated, or we are at the inception stage. We designed the multi-stakeholder platforms, and there are certain results. I think in the future, there will be elements of evaluation and also scaling up that will be coming next.
You spoke about the private sector as well. How do you see the role of the private sector in this context?
So if I talk about the global context today, what the private sector is very keen on thinking about are the ESG. So environment, sustainability, governance. These are terms that have become very mainstream when private sector is thinking about investing in a country. Also this concept of impact investing. So they want to come to a country and of course make profits, but at the same time create purpose. And that is only possible if the country provides information about its SDGs, earmarking its projects with SDGs, identifying what a green recovery means. That is what will entice, I think, the type of private sector and the type of investment that countries are looking for going forward. So again, multinational institutions, multinational banks such as World Bank, EBRD, AIIB, all of you are there to push for the green recovery. You have SDGs always as a goal. Once we are doing together these projects, it creates a very good basis for the private sector to come in and participate. So I think also designing the multi-stakeholder platforms to include private sector pushes definitely and accelerates the agenda towards SDGs.
So let's maybe zoom out for a moment from Egypt and think about sort of the global architecture, or are there some parts of the system that you think is not working, or where there are big gaps, missing institutions in the global architecture, or what is missing?
I think, I mean, you know, different institutions have different rules and procedures, and also different time horizons when it comes to being able to push, you know, their lending. And one, and you mentioned something very important, this idea of front loading and the ability to disperse to all countries that are willing to grab, if you will, in order to create that recovery that is very much needed for the global economy. So I think for each of the institutions to try and see how we can really expedite the processes to be able to benefit at this moment in time, so that, you know, this disparity that we might be seeing going forward as the advanced world is faster in the vaccines, as they might be, you know, pulled out of the downturn faster than those left behind. That gap, you know, can be filled by trying to have more quick and more expedited ways of being able to allocate that lending. So that is one which is very important. The other thing is that only few of the international banks are able to put private equity, if you will, in some of the you know, private sector financing that can happen in countries. So ODA doesn't only go to governments, it also goes to the private sector. So if there's more of that, as we are trying to encourage a green recovery, as we're trying to encourage more private sector engagement, you know, having more ODA targeted to the private sector, I think that is extremely important going forward. That would help the national recovery in countries as well as the global recovery. So those would be, I would say, two very important points. The third one, and that is something related to Africa and maybe other Middle Eastern countries, this concept of country guarantees. So that is something sometimes that stifles this type of financing. And again, this type of financing is one that shows global solidarity. It's one that is earmarked to certain projects. So there's an element of, you know, the concessional element comes in for a reason. So if we are able to overcome some of these stumbling blocks, I feel that more can be done for all countries. And this is going to benefit, as I mentioned, the global recovery as well.
I mean, the most immediate sort of architecture that matters for Egypt is the European Union. And as you know, there's a lot of discussion in the European Union on what should be the, you know, the allocation of work between the different institutions. Should there be some, should we merge it into one European Sustainable Development Bank? You know, what should be the role of AIIB, EBRD, all the national development finance institutions? How does EU look as a contributor from the Egyptian perspective or from the African perspective?
So, you know, I wouldn't limit it to the Egypt-EU story, but more generally, you know, there has been a decision to create Team Europe, so that when you're talking about the European institutions, they can all pool in, if you will, in order to push for financing. I think again, there will be an internal design or redesign that needs to take place to ensure that practically that's possible. Because again, when we have financing agreements with EBRD, their nature is very different from those that are with EIB. So this is the nature of the institution. So when we say Team Europe, if you will, it's very useful and sounds like there will be a more pool of funds at the outset, but it does require practically a lot of work on the processes. That was one of the points I made earlier. So in economics we always say learning by doing. So as we move forward in the process, we're going to see that. But I think one very important difference that we are seeing now with the EU has typically and historically been very much on the grant side. So they like to go in if we have UN projects, and this is again globally, not just in the case of Egypt, in order to provide a grant element in the different for the different projects. Of course, grants in general, depending on the size and the level of development in a country, usually are disproportionately less. So now the idea is to have bigger projects, flagship projects, ones that tackle renewable energy, green hydrogen, and so forth. And that's where the idea of a bigger pool through Team Europe can help have impact. And you went back and you discussed private sector, and it's exactly that, to have that impact investment. So if this is actually, if this materializes, it's a fantastic opportunity, as I mentioned, to have privately led projects through this type of financing, the ODA financing. But as I mentioned, the caveat is going to be the processes across that are quite different across the different institutions.
So how do you see the role of China in all this?
Well, you're in Beijing, I assume. So no, China, of course, is it has its very particular model of development. And I believe that there are many countries that look at the Chinese model, one that has had sustained growth, and see how, what are the lessons learned from there. China today is also a creditor country. We see it in different projects in different places around the world. So it's definitely one of the of course global growth setters, global trend setters, if you will. Having the Asian infrastructure bank, of course you're here, I cannot speak when you're around, Erik, but I believe this was a very important message that this is a very important additional bank with tools that is able to again fill maybe faster a void that might have been available before. So again, I know that AIIB today is looking for more infrastructure projects with us and in other countries, and I think that is something which is very favorable. And again, it was a fantastic initiative from China.
Just to clarify, of course, that China is only one out of 103 shareholders of AIIB, but of course China did play a very important role in the beginning of in creating this institution. So, but do you see these? So the Europe, China, do you see? Are they competing? Are they under your multi-stakeholder platform? Is there room for everybody, or is there?
What I can say is that there's so much that needs to be done, and I say this not just in the Egyptian context, but I think after the pandemic, there's so much that could be done everywhere, because the level of that we were on hold for some time as a global economy. So there's what I see is that there's opportunity and scope for a lot of complementarity. But as Dr. Ibrahim mentioned, knowledge and humility. I think those were the two terms you used in your opening remarks. So I think the knowledge sharing and expertise that the different institutions have, with a little bit of humility, this much, we can definitely push a development agenda which is extremely ambitious, not just on the national level, because at the end of the day, the global economy and the global development is really the addition of the pieces. So if we are able to do the pieces in a constructive, effective, and efficient and impactful way, that way we are affecting the globe. So I believe that, no, I do not see it as competition. I see that there's a lot of complementarity, and that's the essence of what you called for as country platforms, and what we have implemented as multi-stakeholder platforms is through the level of transparency that a country provides and a level of transparency that the development partners among themselves provide. We can do a lot together. So I'm optimistic, and I always say that we don't have to compete to get better results. We can complement and actually get good results for everyone.
So I'm going to open it up for the audience now also, but so if you have questions, please feel free to send them in the chat, or just raise your hand. So while we're waiting for people to respond, maybe picking up what you talked about now. So of course, when we came with those original proposals, it was very much also about not only about transparency, it was about a number of core standards. You mentioned procurement standards around how contracts are being signed, and very much to allow more contracting, get more, you said, transparent, more consistency across different institutions, and maybe even sometimes pool the balance sheets of these institutions, because if you have similar contracts, that makes it much easier. So that's very much in the spirit of what you were talking about. So we have a question here. Let's see where this is. So no one less than Heba Handusa. Please, Heba, the floor is yours. Do I need to do it? Okay, great.
Thank you so much for being with us, Erik. As usual, you bring something to us at ERF all along. My question is really my concern for the recovery path. Of course, I'm always an optimist, so assuming that the recovery has begun or is about to begin in the developed world, the rich countries, how much of what is hoped for is called the green recovery can spill over into the developing world as borrowers, etc. Is there any effort on each side, whether it's the developing world under some umbrella, to ask the rich countries and the banking institutions, etc., to provide aid or concessionary finance, so that rather than just recovering in terms of getting jobs, etc., we do more on climate change, etc. I think it's a big concern, and I'm not sure how much of that concern is with the rich countries. So it's to both you, Erik, and to Rania, to tell us what you think.
So Heba, I'll give the floor to Dr. Rania in a moment, but just say that this is very much on top of our mind. We are very concerned that this recovery will reinforce the divergence that we have seen during the crisis. And we've seen the rates of vaccinations so different between developing and advanced economies, and also emerging markets are lagging very much. So, and of course, there is a risk that a lot of this focus on environmental, social governance, that this discriminates against emerging and developing countries, and that some of the new rules around climate and what qualifies as climate finance and so on discriminates. And so I think it's really on our responsibility to provide menus of options that these countries can choose from, and that there is an integration of the experience from what has happened in the progress that's been made in Europe and to some extent certainly in parts of the United States, but also in parts of Asia. So that should be integrated and presented as real policy options with finance. I think that is the answer. But Dr. Rania, this is your.
Yeah, well, first, I cannot be on a call with Dr. Hiba without mentioning that I was one of the first summer interns at ERF in 1994. And so it brings me great pleasure that I'm in a closing, session of ERF in her presence after so many years. So thank you, Dr. Hiba, for everything you've done for the country and for pushing, the concept of think tanks in the region. When we take a look at at climate change, it's becoming not a luxury that countries might think about. It's really becoming a prerequisite in many ways. Today, if we take a look at the EBRD, there's a decision taken by the board that future lending cannot go to certain projects that do not that might be polluting or environmentally not friendly. So it's really now becoming entrenched in the sort of requirements of the different institutions. But a fact is, for example, if we take Africa, all of Africa is responsible for less than 2% of global emissions. So there is this discrepancy between the calls from the developed world and how much pollution, if you will, or emissions is being created from the developing countries. Most recently, of course, we have John Kerry, who's the special envoy of President of the US on climate change. And he was in Cairo a few weeks ago. And what they are doing is they are creating funds, mobilizing funds. I think it's in billions of dollars to basically help countries exactly do what Dr. Hiba was mentioning, which is to be compliant or to move towards more climate savvy or climate consistent projects and policies so that these resources are made available. And it's going to be our job as international cooperation, I'm sure in other countries, whomever is my counterpart, to really see how each country can benefit from such concessional funding, which is available to exactly tackle the question Dr. Hiba put in. But what I want to say, Erik, is that it's going to be challenging going forward because in general, just because the way all countries were doing the design of their projects or moving ahead, there have been changes coming and we have to adapt to that and adapt to that fast. We as Egypt might be a little bit ahead compared to some other countries because we have a renewable energy strategy. We have taken decisions in the cabinet regarding investment projects that the government finances have to be more than 30% of them need to be compliant with environmental change. So countries have to move very fast in realizing that the green recovery is a reality because multilateral institutions are really changing that thinking as well.
Excellent.
Thank you, Dr. Hiba. Thank you for having your picture. It's so nice to see you.
Thank you.
So there's a question here from Wasim Mina. I think a very good question actually to both of us, but I'll let you start, Rania. This is how do you operationalize humility in development?
Oh, it's easy. You just have to be humble. But I think everyone likes to be part of success. And when we work together, we become successful. So I believe that if a country is designing projects well, implementing them, securing financing from different institutions, working Dr. Ibrahim mentioned early on that, you know, how can think tanks work with governments and so forth? And it's true. I mean, when stakeholders are around the table, involved in the design, involved in the implementation. I mean, Dr. Hiba is civil society now in Egypt, and she, you know, works with the government and works with the international community to create impact. So this is humility from all sides, creating a success story. So I think everyone wants to be a part of that, and when that is the objective, creating impact and so forth. I think with all our development partners, I have seen from our side and from the side of our partners a lot of will. I believe that the pandemic has also made us all very humble anyway, because no one had the golden or the, you know, the silver bullet. Everyone had to work and everyone had to put their share and their fair part of it so that we can get out of it. So I think that 2020 was a year where we learned by force, if you will, the merits or the modalities of humility.
That's lovely.
And then I just to supplement that, of course, I think it's so clear that we don't have all the answers, and no one has all the answers, and you know, we can only get to reasonable answers by working together, and that's, you know, I think what this year has told us. Dr. Ibrahim, you had also some questions for Dr. Rania.
Yes, thank you very much, Erik, for the opportunity. I would also like to welcome Hiba, Handusa. Of course, we are always extremely delighted and motivated, Hiba, let me say, by having you. And thank you so much for giving us the time and sharing your views and wisdom, really. I have a question actually for both Her Excellency Dr. Rania, as well as for you, Dr. Erik, is about the view that developing countries and emerging market economic countries are increasingly seeing partnership with the private sector as a better or a more secured kind of approach to financing much needed projects, especially mega projects that Rania alluded to, in order to fend off the tendency to accumulate debt very fast. So the question here is for both the AIIB, as well as, of course, for Rania as a member of the cabinet. This is an instrument that, in terms of the international partnership or development partnership, is given priority. For example, mega projects, say in Egypt or any other countries in the sphere of operations of the Asian Bank. Are you engaged or planning to engage in actually kind of catalyzing or supporting the kind of you know, build, operate, and transfer BOT type investment? Is that something that's going to see more of it in the future? And then, if I may, I have a question for Rania about the climate change, especially in terms of the sea level rise. And as we know, in Egypt and Tunisia and most of the coastal economies, Mediterranean coastal economies, the economic gravity is pulling towards the coast. And so actually making a huge paradigm shift in terms of investment priorities does require considerable effort and also a major decision by governments of the region. Perhaps maybe if you could share with us any ideas and planning in the horizon for Egypt to actually you know, try to adjust that, if incrementally, towards Upper Egypt. Thank you.
So Erik, should I go ahead or?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. So on private sector engagement, absolutely. And let me just give one example from the past and one example that is happening now. In 2015, when Egypt was just thinking about renewable energy, there had to be a structural reform to take place, and that is changing the feed-in tariff to allow private sector to be able to come into the market. When the government took that decision, financing was availed for public-private partnerships and for the private sector, and came out Bin Ban, which is the flagship project for the IFC, and EBRD was in there, and many others. So definitely there is that will, and that is that commitment and that is something that is practically on the ground and operational. Most recently, sectors such as transportation, which is completely over history regulated and run by government. Today, we have dry ports, their operations are offered to the private sector, consortiums are being put together. Same thing now contemplated for the railway. So there is that that shift that is happening. We can argue it took time, etc., but at least it is operationalized. Today we have IFIs coming in to help with the financing of private sector in dry ports in 6th of October and Ashir min Ramadan or 10th of Ramadan city. So those are important examples. When it comes to maybe I would say a piece of an information which may not be we're quantifying it now, but in many of the mega projects that do exist, it was the private sector outsourced to implement them. So it was more a project management, but then you see many of the projects. If you go to, for instance, the biggest wastewater management project, Bahr al-Ba'r, which is in Sinai, it's huge. It's being implemented by Orascom. So there are several examples of private sector engagement, and we want to push that even more going forward. And one of the very impressive parts of Egypt's development story with the international community is that many projects are implemented by the private sector, and you see the level of their capacity grow. And now they are ready actually to do the same type of projects in other countries with IFIs, particularly in Africa. And that is something that we are trying to shed light on. African Development Bank does a lot of projects and to see that whether it's wastewater management, whether it's transportation, and others that are being implemented by the private sector, that can also be done in other countries by our companies. When it comes to climate change and water, absolutely. I mean, I did not know these terms before becoming Minister of International Cooperation a year and a half ago, but the concepts of mitigation and adaptation and having this integrated, if you will, in many of the projects, making sure that you don't waste the scarce water and today when we are thinking about any of the development projects, we have to take many of this into account and give it a priority compared to other projects.
Yes, since you asked me also, Dr. Ibrahim, I would say there are two things that, in addition to what Dr. Rania said. One is that we talk a lot about the need to lend money to developing countries, but actually, if we can have equity, that is, a very good supplement. And we know that foreign direct investment have not, held up as much as we would have liked to. So that is one aspect. But I think there's a much more profound role for the private sector, and what Dr. Rania described, I think, is part of that. That the private sector can play a very creative role in bringing about structural transformation by putting in skills, energy, ideas, and working with the governments to help governments develop that side. Unfortunately, many of these projects go wrong at some point, and it's very important, and that's, I think, is the role for the IFIs to be the honest broker in these relationships and try to make sure that there is often an asymmetry between these very experienced international operators and local authorities, and maybe have not done any before, or very few of these projects. So there is a need for a broker, I think, often, and to exploit that the good side of these collaborations. There are also, as we know, many problems with these kind of private public-private partnerships or private-public partnerships. So we need to find ways of making sure that we get the best out of them and not leave them open for exploitation and so on. So we have a number of questions now. I'm conscious of time also, but there is a question around relating to what you just responded to on climate. So using these multi-stakeholder platforms, how do you see them? Can they be used specifically for climate finance, or can they help deal with these different? Actually, he mentions also, this is Yusuf Osman. He mentioned also for pandemic response. As you know, there's just been a high-level panel led by Tharman Shanmugaratnam, the former Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, who looked at these pandemic response and what the world can do to put more resources towards this. But do you think this multi-stakeholder platform has a role to play in this context as well?
No, absolutely. I mean, today many of the development banks have green financing tools. And these green financing tools are not only available for the sovereigns, but they are available for the private sector, going back to Dr. Ibrahim's comment. And what we are trying to do in our multi-stakeholder platforms, I had a meeting a few days ago with all chambers of commerce in the country, because we wanted to make sure that we close the information gap. Not all private sector knows that they can access ODA financing through the different multilateral banks. And we want to familiarize them with these opportunities, particularly that there are more innovative tools of financing, such as the green financing. So this is one key aspect, and it's developing. It's developing because, again, the world, the pandemic has really reprioritized, the issue of climate. At the beginning, a few years ago, it would be there as maybe a sub bullet in one of the communique, or a sub bullet in for a workshop. Today, it's on a main panel. It is very vivid, and as I mentioned, no one will escape it. So all of us have to be prepared. And when we say all, it's not just the government, it's also the private sector that might need technical assistance to understand how to, internalize it in their practices and so forth. So that's in terms of the, yes, multi-stakeholder platforms play a very, very important role in clarifying what, to all stakeholders, what the climate tools or the financing tools, the green tools that are provided by the international community to sovereigns and to the private sector as well.
There are a lot of questions coming in also from, I understand, from WhatsApp. And so there is one question, which sectors have benefited the most from this multi-stakeholder platform? Maybe actually the question is about in the past 10 years in Egypt, what has been which sectors have benefited the most? And yeah, there's a lot of praise for you, what you have done. So, but there are a couple of questions. Maybe this could be a good way to round off the conversation. But there's a lot of questions also around how can countries in the emerging world and in the Arab world work together to maybe strengthen their bargaining power on these multi-stakeholder platforms, or making sure that the standards are serving them, and maybe not just international companies or the international players. How do you see that? There's a question from what was his name? Mohammed Samam from Yemen specifically, also asking, you know, what can Egypt and maybe other countries in the region do to help Yemen in the current situation?
Well, I want to tell Mohammed that I was just in a meeting with some Saudi colleagues, and we were putting together a way to see how we can maybe extend invitations to Yemenis for technical assistance in the different institutional capacity. So this just happened before this webinar. So Yemen is on our mind, and we are thinking on in ways to do that. Let me just say that multi-stakeholder platforms, we started in April 2020. Again, it's becoming more institutional in the way we do our work in the ministry and invite other ministries and so forth. So it's a very effective tool of international cooperation. When we take a look at the different projects that have benefited from official development assistance in Egypt, the number one sector is on the infrastructure. That is related to whether it's housing, whether it's, and here we're talking about social housing, water waste management, which is extremely important to save on the water and reuse it for agriculture and so forth. Also, transportation has benefited a lot. And just on this occasion, since we're closing, tomorrow I'll be launching a book, Stakeholder Engagement Through Economic Diplomacy. And we give Egypt's story for fostering multilateralism and international cooperation. And in it, we show how we created a framework of economic diplomacy with 3 principles, the multi-stakeholder platforms. We also did an ODA SDG mapping. So for the whole official development assistance portfolio, we mapped it to the SDGs using different methodologies, and that we will reveal that tomorrow. And then finally, a global partnership narrative, creating a narrative with all our development partners, which is consistent. And that narrative is that everything we do, we have people at the core, projects in action, and purpose as the driver. So those are our PMPMP. It's not PPP, which is private-public partnership, but it's people, projects, purpose. So please join us tomorrow. It's online, 3 p.m. Cairo time. It's launched from with London School of Economics. And we also have Minouche Shafi and Carmen Reinhardt, and Erik, of course, will be with us tomorrow sharing that launch.
Well, thank you so much, Rania, and thank you also, Dr. Ibrahim, for giving me this opportunity to have this conversation. And thank you, Dr. Heba, for joining us. I think you ended up talking about towards the end about the need for, thinking across the region and thinking about.
Can I just make one? I forgot something I wanted to say. The Ministry of International Cooperation here as well is responsible for the bilateral and trilateral agreements with the Arab world. So whether we are doing, which we call in Arabic, al-ligan al-mushtaraka, and there, for instance, whether it's with Jordan, we just saw, there was the summit yesterday with Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq, and there was preparation for that on joint projects in electricity and others. And because, Egypt has a very robust story when it comes to development projects, the idea is to see how we can also help in doing joint work. So that is in response to the joint Arab work that can take place. So there are plenty of, I don't want to call them opportunities, there are things that are actually happening as we speak. It's not, we were in Libya at the beginning of Ramadan, also discussing what we can do there with them, helping them, in the development process that they would be undertaking.
And I think here you can also see the role for ERF, of course, to creating a community of thinking and bringing academic ideas, policy ideas into this conversation. So again, thank you very much. Thank you for everyone who's been watching and listening, and I look forward to more opportunities to participate in ERF's wonderful annual conferences. So thank you very much, and good night from Beijing. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, Dr. Hiba. Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharif. Shireen, are we offline or are we online? Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. Thank you very much for the invitation. I enjoyed it.
The pleasure was really all of us, for all of us. And thank you so much for your time and for the great ideas, and wish you all the success in Egypt and also in the partnership with the other countries as well.
Inshallah.